From Cambridge University Press, in collaboration with The Naked Scientists, this is episode 9 of the Cambridge Prisms podcast, addressing real-world challenges in research and discovery. I'm Chris Smith. This month, how AI can help us plan a more resilient water supply, but only if the data we rely on for our models is up to scratch. Also, if you had to take a paleontological dip, when would be the best and the worst times to avoid being eaten by something? And 40% of the planet are classed as dry lands and rising. So why do we know so little about them, and why does this urgently need to change? But first, marine ecosystems are built around plant and algal species that capture solar energy and feed it up the food chain. Kelps are major players, especially around the Arctic, and as well as being a source of food, kelp forests also provide shelter and breeding grounds for marine life. But a new study suggests that some species are very vulnerable to climate change, which can alter water temperatures as well as water turbidity, and that can affect the amount of light that makes it through. These altered conditions exert a selection pressure, shifting the balance of kelp species away from beneficial forms and towards those that can afford animals a much less hospitable environment, which can also have economic costs for us as well.
My name is Sarina Nitzwitz, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Bremen, and I'm a marine biologist. Kelps can actually be compared to trees on land because they can grow several meters in height and thereby build complex three-dimensional structures above the seafloor. They provide a lot of habitat and nursery ground for a variety of species, and also food as their primary producers. So they're very, very important for those ecosystems and act as foundation species.
And why do we feel that they might be threatened, or impacted at least, by climate change?
Because the Arctic is one of the regions that is actually most affected by climate change, and we see temperature rises at a rate about 4 times the global average, and that leads to a variety of cascading other changes, such as an increase of marine heat waves, but also all of this temperature rises cause glacier snow and permafrost to melt, and the huge amount of meltwater that results from this melt is washing a lot of sediments into the fjords, which is then changing the light availability underwater.
So it's effectively a 1-2 punch that might hit the kelp then. Not only is the water temperature departing away from where they've evolved to be most happy, but the water could become very, very cloudy and cut off the light supply.
Exactly. Both temperature and light are very, very important drivers for those kelps. We need to know how the kelp forest dynamics is changing in the future.
And how can you get at this? Is there an easy way, because you can't speed up time and ask, well, this is what it was like before climate change, here it is afterwards. So how can you get at this to get a reasonable answer to what the impact might be?
We designed a multifactorial experiment where we exposed those 2 locally abundant kelp species to, first of all, different light conditions. Those light conditions mimicked either a clear water column or a turbid water column with all the meltwater. And then on top of that, when they were acclimated to those light conditions, we exposed them to a marine heat wave.
And how do you gauge what impact that's having on the kelp?
Yes, so we measured their physiology, for example, their growth, their photosynthetic activity, and also their photosynthetic rates and respiration rates. And on top of that, we also measured their biochemical response, so their pigment composition, for example.
And when you do this, I presume you're looking at 2 different kelps, because then you can ask, well, what's likely to happen to a range of populations? Yes. But when you do this, how do those 2 variables, the temperature and how cloudy the water is, affect the outcomes for the kelps?
When both of the kelp species were exposed to high light conditions, so basically a clear water column, they experienced physiological stress levels, which was actually destructive for them. This stress level got even higher when the high light conditions interacted with cold temperatures. And the stress level was then mitigated by the marine heat wave. So they actually benefited from warmer temperatures because both of the kelp species we were investigating are not Arctic endemic. So their optimum growth temperature is warmer than that what we currently see in the Arctic.
And of course, the warm temperature would also bring with it more meltwater, which would cloud the water, which would reduce the light, which would reduce the light stress.
Yes, we also saw that with lower light intensities, the light stress got reduced, but the productivity and growth of both kelp species also got reduced.
Well, what do we take away from this then? It sounds like it's not necessarily all bad news for kelp, because there's going to be some that may do quite well from climate change then. They will be less stressed and they will retain their productivity. Is that good news then, that we can relax on that front?
Physiologically, kelps can cope with those conditions that we will expect in Arctic near future. However, what we also saw is that depending on the conditions, the competition balance between both kelp species also changed. So we saw that one kelp species, the sieve kelp, actually did better in darker and warmer conditions, so basically near future, compared to the other species, the sugar kelp. And the sieve kelp is also characterized by high contents of herbivore deterrents. So if that kelp species, the sieve kelp, would become dominant in a future kelp forest, the nutritional value of the kelps might be reduced for higher trophic levels.
And hence there would still potentially be knock-on effects further up the food chain.
Yes, exactly. Up to the humans, because then commercially used fish or invertebrate species also are reduced in their abundance, then that might also have socioeconomic impacts.
That was Serena Nitzevitz. We're staying with the water and climate change, but onto AI now, and the models that are increasingly being deployed to help water engineers to keep the taps running. But as Babak Zolgada-Azli argues, up until now their design has largely focused and dwelled heavily on the quality of the model's architecture, rather than the quality of the data that it's processing. And with any AI or other model, when it comes to the quality of the output, the old adage, rubbish in, rubbish out, has never been more important. So making sure we have high quality data sets and data collection methods is essential to ensure the results and the predictions we get are reliable.
It is far too easy to misuse these models or misinterpret their results. And imagine a case that you are embedding these models into some of your most vulnerable but most important infrastructures, like your water systems. If these models start to producing results that are not necessarily reflective of the real world, then you have to face the consequences, then you would face problems.
Is it the model itself, as in the way computationally it's working, that's wrong? Or is it the underpinning data, the information we are training it to use in engineering its own thought processes, that's at fault? Or is it both?
Very good question. There is this way of thinking that the algorithm is the most important thing, and we are putting this in the center and front, and assuming every breakthrough is going to come from improving these models, becoming more efficient with how we are going to do about the computations, and so on and so forth. However, there are those who believe that data is also important and should be at the focal point because the model is only as good as the data that we provided. So the idea here in this specific case of water engineering being is that oftentimes we don't have enough reliable data to train these models. So essentially they haven't seen the word enough so that they can replicate it in a good way.
Why is this not already something that people have confronted and dealt with when engineering these models?
I usually give this example. Imagine that you are a teacher and you want to teach your students. The challenge here is that the only exposure to the real world, your only material to teach this student is that you have a window to the real world and you're asking them to start drawing their real world through this window. Now imagine this window being really small. Because of this limitation, the students is not being able to pick up every talent during this training session, right? Why haven't we seen any problem? The issue is that usually these models, for natural phenomena, it would take decades to see every pattern. So, for instance, we have to monitor and observe the performance of these models in these long decades to see if they are reliable or not. But we can't obviously wait this long because at the point that we realize we made a mistake, it could be too late. But the signs and the red flags are there because Every now and then you would dig deeper in the performance of these models. You have experts to go into how these models are trained. And if you go deeper, you would realize that the logic inside these models sometimes are not on par with the reality of the world.
What do you regard as the solution then? Is it just making these models more explainable? Is it having a sooner, more rapid feedback loop so that we can work out if they're going off kilter? Or is it just about enhancing the data that we feed into them so we don't settle for that very small window on the world that you use as a beautiful analogy? We go for the widest vista we can.
The issue is data. So first thing first, I think we have to manage our expectation and start seeing the problem for what it is. We shouldn't expect these problems to be fixed overnight as well. It would take years, if not decades. But this sort of highlights the importance of starting investing in this. Because even if we start to collect more data as we speak, it would take decades, if not longer, to build up enough data set to see tangible, meaningful changes in the performance of these models. Convincing both public and private sector to invest in this is more challenging than what you would think, because the return on investment is not necessarily that immediate or sometimes that apparent. Say in some context, if you start collecting data, you can sell the data either directly or indirectly and get some feedback or financial compensation. But in this case, it's not going to reward you in a financial way. But if we look at this problem as investing in our strategic resources, I think it is far too easier to justify these costs. At the end of the day, I think the best way I can describe it, our relationship with these models, is that AI and computational intelligence should be seen as a tool that we need to supervise, not the other way around.
Babak Zogodarasli there. He's working with the Universities of Queensland and Exeter. This is the Cambridge Prisms podcast. I'm Chris Smith. In a moment, can decades of coastal data reveal what climate change has in store for seaside ecosystems? Before that, though, the modern marine megafauna, broadly meaning big ocean inhabitants, play important and ecological roles and includes many charismatic species that have drawn the attention of both the scientific community as well as the general public. Just recently, for instance, we learned that migrating whales move thousands of tons of nitrogen around the planet. We previously had no idea. However, the extinct marine megafauna have never been assessed as a whole. In fact, there's not even an agreed definition of what constitutes extinct marine megafauna, and what were their biological and ecological patterns. This was the challenge that the University of Zurich's Kristina Kosakova set for herself.
Large animals in the oceans, which we also call megafauna, are extremely important for these ecosystems. They do a lot of important roles in these oceans. They transport nutrients, they shape the populations of other animals, and so on. And in the modern oceans, we do have a definition for what constitutes marine megafauna, which is anything heavier than 45 kilograms. But we actually never properly had a proper definition of marine megafauna of extinct animals, of the ones that we can find in the fossil record. So the aim of this paper was to kind of do a thorough search of literature and compile a database of all animals that are larger than 1 meter, and then make a decision whether this kind of value would be good as a definition for what constitutes marine megafauna of extinct animals.
How far back in time did you go?
We went all the way back to the Cambrian, so that's the beginning, that's when the boom of life happened, which is more than 500 million years ago. We actually find our first instances of megafauna already at this time. So we try to cover the entire span of complex life on Earth.
Quite a tall order, that one, isn't it? How did size change over time? Because when we think back to the era of dinosaurs and things, we think of these enormous creatures where life today is small in comparison. But immediately it strikes me that in the sea, we still have today enormous creatures. Blue whales are absolutely huge. And is that always been the case, or has there been a shift over time?
When we compiled this data, we've noticed that we always see increase in size over time. Animals do tend to get larger, and the rate at which they do it can differ. And it also depends on what kind of group of animals it is, whether we're talking reptiles or invertebrates or mammals. Some of the largest animals that we found were found in the more recent times, in this period called Neogene, which is from around 23 million years ago. And this is kind of when we started seeing, for example, the iconic megalodon. We started seeing some really large whales. But even though these animals could have reached sizes around 20 meters, they are still 10 meters shorter than the blue whale, which we see around today, which I think is incredible that we happen to live at the same time as the largest marine animal that ever lived.
The interesting transition that's also, I suppose, happened is that we've gone from an era of largely reptiles to an era where the really big animals are mammals now in the oceans, haven't we?
Definitely. So actually, reptiles are the largest group of extinct large animals that we found. The largest amount of large reptiles that we found were identified from the Mesozoic, which is also called the Age of Reptiles. And this is exactly the time where you would also be thinking about dinosaurs. We, of course, at the end of the Mesozoic, had the bolide impact, which caused all dinosaurs to go extinct, and it also heavily affected animals in the marine realm, which included these large ichthyosaurs, which are these kind of fish-shaped reptiles that really dominated the oceans. And actually, the largest animal that we found in the, not only in the Mesozoic, but overall, was an ichthyosaur, which could reach 21 meters in length. In the following era, the radiation of mammals occurred and they started dominating the oceans. Although it didn't happen immediately, it did take some time for these large whales and other mammals to spread out and reach the incredible sizes that they reach today.
Now you've got this. It's obviously a first step to establish a foundation for understanding more about what hasn't made it into the present era. What has emerged in terms of interesting findings, and also what gaps has this revealed to us, things we don't know that we really now need to go after to fill in the holes?
This study kind of represents a good starting point just by providing that definition of what constitutes megafauna, what constitutes these impressively large animals, which then can be applied if needed in other studies. Another thing is that during the process of gathering information, like, for example, the ecological roles, and so, for example, like, gathering the information of what kind of diet some of these animals had, we realized that for quite a few of them, we still do not have this kind of information. And this is quite crucial to be able to make proper conclusions explaining what was happening in the ecosystems. We do have some kind of starting point in this study. We do have pretty good information about, for example, majority of the megafauna were large animals that ate other animals, so they weren't really filter feeders, unlike what we see today, which is really interesting. But for many, many other aspects, there are still definitely gaps that need to be fulfilled.
One thing I often wonder when I sort of go down to the beach and I look out on the sea and realise that 3/4 of our planet is covered in ocean, and I often think back to the time when life was in its infancy. Were those oceans absolutely replete and boiling with life, or were they relatively underpopulated? Was it masses of empty water and the odd thing living in it? What was it like then?
It really depends on which specific time in the history of life you look at. Of course, the Cambrian explosion is popular because that was the time where really life was booming. There was a lot of shallow areas, areas where life truly was replete. Whereas if you would go to times after some kind of mass extinctions, of course, the life would be more rare.
So if you had to go back in time and you were going to take a dip, because I often think, would something eat me the minute I got into one of these primitive oceans? What period would you go back to knowing you'd be safe to have a swim versus if you desperately wanted to get eaten, when would be the best time to go back to?
I would say that for a human, I suppose Cambrian would be the best time because that was the era of invertebrates. And I'm not sure if some of these invertebrates would know what to do with a fleshy being such as myself if they found me in the water. Whereas if I would desperately want to get eaten, I would say like any time when the megalodon was around is a safe bet.
Believe it or not, I have always wanted to ask a paleontologist that. Christina Kosakova there. Coastal environments are one of the most important habitats, not just for their carbon sequestration, but for their protection against oceanic weather events. The exact impacts that climate change will have on these areas is not yet fully understood, though. However, What we do have are decades of data collected by a range of actors, from governmental bodies through to citizen scientists even. And so scientists at the University of Virginia have been analysing these data to extract the signals that might relate to climate change, so we can work out what the future might hold. Here's Scott Doney.
We're trying to figure out how climate change might be changing coastal marshes and the lagoons that surround them. And we had decades worth of water quality data that had been collected, but really hadn't been analyzed in depth. So we were trying to dig in and see, can we see a trend in warming because of climate change? Can we see a trend in the biology of the organisms that live in the lagoon? And then can we start to understand what the implications of those trends are?
What specific things were you measuring or subjecting to scrutiny to see if you could see a signal in them?
It's things like the temperature of the water, the salinity, because we're in the coastal ocean, and so you have fresh water coming from land and seawater coming in from the ocean. Chlorophyll, which is a proxy for how much phytoplankton is there, and then also things like nutrients. Nutrient pollution can drive harmful algal blooms, for example.
How do you tease out from what you see, though, as a genuine signal of climate change versus something which is a normal cycle, which might operate over long time scales, but would look like it's climate change because it's changing in line with everything else?
That is the challenge. The simplest thing that we started with was we wanted to see from this long-term, several decades of data, could we first just pull out something simple like the seasonal cycle? The study was actually done by a graduate student as part of her master's thesis. And one of the things that I thought the student did, which was really interesting, was there are groups that have also put out autonomous instruments that are measuring very high frequency data, like every quarter of an hour, but those are only in a few locations. So she did statistical tests to see, given that we have some high frequency records, can we sample those high frequency records like the way we're sampling this decadal record and recover the same information? So it's kind of this idea of we can't go back in time to measure things 40 years ago, but can we say, if the record looked like it does now with these robotic instruments, can we say something about how the past might have evolved?
And can you? Does it work?
It seemed to work. We were able to show, at least with the statistics, that we had collected enough data over 30 or 40 years to be able to resolve the seasonal cycle. And in a lot of places, we could actually show that the seasonal cycle is normal. Things warm in the summer and they cool in the winter. And what she was able to show in this study is that shape of that seasonal cycle was actually changing. So in some places it was getting warmer, but it was also getting warmer earlier in the year. And that's what we would expect based on models.
Is this generalizable? So could I take your model and take it to the opposite coast of the US or even to a European coastline and apply some of the same techniques in order to ask the same questions there, do you think?
We were hoping to develop a methodology that could be used in other places. And one of the really encouraging things since the paper came out, colleagues at other sites in the US who have this water quality data have applied the same sorts of approaches and are seeing similar results. So that's very encouraging.
And can it capture, because you mentioned we wanted to know what people are doing. The other major dramatic change is in recent decades, we've seen the human population, go up by tens of percent. I mean, we've got a third more people on Earth now than when I was doing my PhD. So does that also get captured by this sort of model? And how can we control for that? Because that must also make quite a considerable impact on a lot of these metrics.
So I've worked in other places where there's a big impact from a growing human population. One of the biggest signals you see is because of nutrient runoff from fertilizer and from atmospheric pollution. And we're trying to use this site in Virginia as sort of a baseline of what signals might look like without that local human factor. And then we can then compare that to places that have, say, a larger input of fertilizer runoff or more atmospheric pollution.
And when you compare your model with the predictions that other models, because other people are doing sort of similar things, or they're asking a similar question but in a different way they're approaching it, or or getting at different outcomes. Does it broadly align with what generally is accepted as the likely trajectory? If so, what are the predictions then?
Our work was consistent in that we expect to see coastal waters warming. The freshwater balance, which is really important for the ecosystem, is going to vary from place to place. Some places are going to get wetter with more runoff from land, and other places are going to get drier. So that's going to be pretty site specific. I think one of the interesting things is we saw at some of the stations that we have data from that when the ocean got warmer, there was also more chlorophyll, more phytoplankton. And we've seen that in a couple of other places. That's tricky in the models. The models are still kind of looking at that. There are some places around the globe where we expect the ocean to become more productive, and places where we expect productivity to drop off, at least where we were looking, where we could see what we think is a climate signal. We saw warming and increased biological productivity.
Scott Doney from the University of Virginia there. Now from water everywhere to the opposite end of the spectrum, dry lands. These are arid and semi-arid areas where the amount of water that evaporates or transpires from the land is just about balanced by the amount of water that falls as rain. And believe it or not, they actually account for over 40% of the planet's land surface area, and 2.5 billion people live in these regions. But the data we have on them aren't comprehensive, and because climate change is almost certain to intensify drought and therefore increase the planet's dry land proportion, it's becoming critical that we fill in these gaps. And this is what the University of Indiana's Lixin Wang is advocating for.
For this article, we are looking at the complex relationship between plant production and water input in dryland. The reason for that is because dryland has a lot of productivity. When you look at it, it doesn't seem like it has a lot of plants, but actually dryland contribute a lot to the productivity. At the same time, dryland productivity is very important for our food security, for carbon sequestration. So it's very important to understand what controlling the dryland productivity and to make future predictions.
And I suppose this is important because we anticipate with climate change that some areas of the world are going to get wetter, but a lot of areas are going to get a lot drier. And so this is almost certainly going to become more important.
Exactly. Most of the dryland actually are predicted to become drier in the future decades.
And is your motivation that there just isn't the evidence base and the knowledge there at the moment? And that's why we need to be putting more attention on this?
There are pretty good data-driven evidence showing the rainfall trend for dryland. But for our perspective, for our article, we are looking at the relationship between rainfall and productivity. Because intuitively, most people think dryland is water limited. If you give them more water, they must have more productivity. This is mostly true, but there are many locations or many scenarios they are not true. So we basically try to understand why this is the case.
And why do you think it is?
There are actually multiple reasons. So we talk about the reason from two major perspectives. From the methodology aspect, we talk about what are the potential limitations. We quantify how much water are there. And also we talk about the potential limitations, how we quantify plant productivity in dryland, and what other potential mistakes or errors we could make. And also we talk about the ecosystem process, the uniqueness of dryland, why sometimes the ecosystem process is responsible for less strong relationship between rainfall and vegetation productivity here in drylands.
Do they make up a very high fraction of the total then, these particular aspects you're considering, or are they very much edge cases and they've been overlooked?
There are some factors I think is actually very uniform, maybe across the whole dryland. Some are more site specific. For example, right, most often we use precipitation, total annual rainfall, as an indicator of total water input to dryland. This is okay because rainfall is the most available weather variables we can use. But when you are plants, right, so the water you use is actually from soil. It's not actually rainfall per se. So there is a translation between rainfall to soil water availability. There are a couple of issues here. It's not all the rainfall can be used by plants, only portion of this. Dryland is quite sparse in vegetation, so there are a lot of scenarios rainfall falling on the ground just get purely evaporated, so plants can't access that. So that's why some people use the concept of effective precipitation to refer to the part vegetation can use. So ideally, we should use soil water as indicator of plant water availability. But soil water is not as straightforward as rainfall in terms of measurement.
Is that what you're advocating for then? Better data collection, a more comprehensive understanding of all of these areas so that we know how to manage them and what to expect from them as we go forward?
Exactly. Better data and more coverage of data would be very important, right? Dryland has been understudied for a very long time. Most of the time, people assume they are wasteland, there's nothing there, but it's just opposite is true, right? So that's why I think there are recent effort from different government agencies, different funding agencies, try to spend more resources, try to increase the data coverage, but also the type of data we can collect from this very valuable type of ecosystems.
Lixin Wang there from Indiana University. And that is where we have to leave it for this episode. But if you'd like to follow up on any of the references, as well as the interview transcripts for the papers that you've been hearing about in this edition of the programme, head over to nakedscientist.com/prisms. And while you're there, you can also learn, on the off chance you don't already, how you can subscribe to this podcast. And if you'd like to get your teeth into some more science, The Naked Scientists also publish a weekly science news programme, The Naked Scientist Podcast, and details of how you can find that are there too. Meanwhile, if you have some science you'd like to publish, then why not submit it to the journals today, and maybe you can become our next guest here on the Cambridge Prisms podcast. I'm Chris Smith from The Naked Scientists. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.